Jesus deals with the extrovert. He deals with the introvert. The same question, though. If only. You ever been in that situation? If only. God, if only. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. You know what? In our society, I know in different places, most places around the world, when someone dies, there's weeping that goes on. And sometimes there's mourning for a week or 2 weeks. And people get together and they hurt for each other. God has created us that way, right? To experience sorrow. It's a loss. When you lose someone and they die, it's a loss. And we're made that way, right? When we see somebody crying, right? You know, you go to a movie and you see something sad, what do you start doing? You start crying. They don't even know these people. And it's just fake, they're acting, but we start crying. When at my wedding, I was standing there. There was 28 of us there, and Janice's brother was conducting the wedding, the ceremony, and my mom was there. And for some reason, I don't know, maybe because I was the last one to get married, she starts crying. Then the pastor, Janice's brother, he starts crying. Then Janice starts crying. Then everybody starts crying except me. I'm the only one not crying. Okay? God has designed us, to feel for other people. And when especially when you lose someone, right? It's a loss. Paul tells us that when we weep, it's not like people who don't know Christ, because we know that there's life after death. We'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, it said that Jesus was moved, and I believe he was moved. It says he was moved because here's what death does to you. And you know what death is from? Sin. If there was no sin, there would be no death. And Jesus is looking right there at what happens to people, what's been happening to people since the first two people. They've been dying, they've been experiencing death, separation. And so it says that he was moved. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. Jesus, the human, wept. Jesus, God, the God, wept. We get a picture of who God is through Jesus, because Jesus is God. But God is moved by things that hurt us, by things that damage us, by things that cause us loss. If you want to know something about God, know that when you hurt, God hurts. God cares, and Jesus demonstrates it right here. It says, Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved them?" Then the Jews said, "See how he loved them." And some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying?" These guys are saying the same thing. They're saying what? Why? Same thing Mary and Martha said. He could open the eyes of the blind. We just saw that in the chapter before. Couldn't he have done something about this? Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb, and it was a cave, and the stone lay against it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." First, he asked, "Where have they laid him?" Second, he says, "Take away the stone." Does this sound familiar? Does this sound like something you know, another story in the Bible? Which one is it? It's coming up in 9 weeks. It's coming up in 9 weeks. Jesus was saying this event right now is setting up what's going to happen in the future. This event with Lazarus is setting up what's going to happen in the future. You see what's about to happen here. Mary, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time," she said, "Take away this one. By this time there's a stench, for he's been dead 4 days." 4 days he's been dead. By this time his body has begun to decay. You can't do anything now. He's dead and his body has started to decay. Do you think that's true? No, it just told us in the passage that Mark wrote, that those that are dead in Christ will raise first. These guys have been dead for years, but God's going to raise them up somehow. He's going to raise their body. Jesus, God can do that. But it's not something we view as possible, as humanly possible. It takes God. Jesus said, did it not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was laying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. Jesus had been praying for the last number of days that God would do something bigger than what they saw, bigger than what they thought. They said, if only, but God said, I've got something bigger than that. And I know that you hear me, but because of the people who are standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. Now, when he had said these things, where do you think Lazarus was right now? Where was Lazarus right now? Yeah, you know how we know that? There's another Lazarus. The only other Lazarus in the Bible, Jesus told the story about him, right? And this Lazarus died, and he was there with Abraham. And so you can kind of picture Lazarus hanging out for the last few days, the last 4 days, with some of those great saints, right? Abraham's there. Maybe he's talking to Abraham about what God had done and how Abraham heard the voice of God. And maybe he was talking about Moses, and Moses was telling him about what it was like when he saw the burning bush and God spoke to him. And maybe Lazarus even said, you know what, I spoke to him. And who's this new guy? What, you spoke to God? Yeah, I spoke to him. I saw him in the flesh. I used to eat with him. He used to come over to my house. What? Yeah, he used to come over. As a matter of fact, I remember his voice. About that time, Jesus says, Lazarus, in a loud voice. What do you think Lazarus was thinking right then? Wait a minute. I think I recognize that voice. Lazarus! Whoa, guys, I gotta go. Wherever he was back in that tomb. He was hearing Jesus talking to him. He says, come forth. He cried with a loud voice, said, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped in a cloth. He came out bound hand and foot in grave clothes with his face wrapped up. And Jesus said, loose him and let him go. Here's the thing. There are so many times when we ask ourselves, why? We say, if only, God, you would do it this way. But what we need to realize is that God has a big plan. God can do things like raise people from the dead, right? And he doesn't go around necessarily always raising people from the dead, but he showed that he could do it, even a guy that had been 4 days. So when we get to the point where we lose someone, and we say, if only, Jesus says, not if only, but I am the only one that you can believe in. I'm the only one that's experienced death and come back from it, except for Lazarus, who was going to die again. I bet when Lazarus died years later, I bet he wasn't feeling too bad about it. Because he was thinking, I've done this before. I know where I'm going, right? You know what? He did this for us so that we would know where we're going. We would know where we're going. But not only that, but there are hundreds of if-onlys in our lives. When we're saying, if only God would do this, or only if I only hadn't do that, I messed up things, or God hasn't come through for me. And he wants us to say, you know what? God has a bigger plan. Here's the answer. Here's the bottom line for you. When you leave here today and you run into your next if only, stop for a minute and say, wait a minute. I follow the Lord who controls life and death. It's not if only, it's if only I believe. If only I believe in the only one. If only I say, you know what, God, this is in your hands. I'm going to trust you. I don't necessarily understand, but this is in your hands, because it's not if only. It's you are the only one. Last week, I read a story, And I haven't done this before, but I decided that I'm going to read the same story, the same old story that I read last week, this week, because it has application here. So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to read the same story again. My sister sent me a letter about my mom who has Alzheimer's, pretty advanced stage of Alzheimer's. And here's what she said. And last week I couldn't get through it, so this week I've got myself composed so I can get through it here. Hello, family. This is my sister writing about my mom. Hello, family. I want to give you a little testimony about Mom. Very often, Mom is confused, mixing reality with dreams or her past. Several times she's asked why she is still here. You know what she said to me? If only God would just take me. If only. I remind her that our days are in God's hands. And there must be things he still has for her on earth. That temporarily calms her. You may remember Mom's friend at Richmond Memory Care Center, a sweet lady named Beverly. Mom found out that Beverly didn't know if she'd go to heaven when she died, so Mom shared the gospel with Beverly, and she accepted Christ as her Savior. Beverly passed away last week. But my mom added to her story, if only God had taken her. No, Beverly in heaven. If only is in your life, remember, Jesus is the only one who controls heaven and earth, life and death. If only, hand it over to the only one. Let's stand for closing prayer. Dear God, in our lives, we don't know why things happen. A lot of times. Sometimes we don't know why we did stupid things, and we wish, if only I could go back. But we know that you hold the future, and that you can take even the bad things, even the destructive things, and you can turn them around if we believe. Jesus said you're going to see the glory of God if you believe. I pray that today, this week, when we run into the if-onlys, we will say you are the only one. Let's stand for closing song.